Greetings and welcome back to Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel, where today I came here to start this video beside this beautiful little pond to test out today's creation. And that is the lead weights that I'm using on the bottom of these black duck decoys. Okay? So we're going to cast these lead weights. That's the goal. This is an exercise in what you would call minimum viable product. So we're going to talk about casting with the smallest amount of equipment, simplest and easiest to find materials. We're going to use a mixture of sand that we make ourselves from hardware store ingredients, and we are going to successfully cast these little weights. Now I do this in 4 weights. I wasn't sure which one was going to be right. This one turns out to be perfect. You can see him right there. This one's a little lean. That one's not quite heavy enough. So that one wants to lean on his side a little bit, whereas this one is just absolutely perfect. There you go. He's going to dock himself there in this little outlet stream. So we're going to make these. Now, the downside to minimum viable product is coarseness. So I'm not sure how much of it's going to pick up in the camera, but we have our shape very, very nicely, but it's very, very rough. Okay? So there are things that we can do to even out that roughness in future videos, but for this one, minimum viable product. Now, before we get into this and start with the casting process, I want to talk about safety. Liquid metal is very, very dangerous. You want to make sure that you wear a leather apron. You want to make sure that you have good solid shoes, that your pants go down over them, because this can happen. And go for the pour. Well, that was not good. That is called a visit from the Tinsel Fairy. The Tinsel Fairy is very, very mean. She sets stuff on fire, and if you get some of that splashed down in your clothes, you're going to be in a world of hurt. Okay, so wear safety equipment. Also, in that very first thing, I was attempting to just use an old pressure cooker. Don't do that. We go to the proper flask. I had a nice clean flask. I just didn't want to dirty up with lead, and I should have just gone right for the right equipment right at the beginning. So use the right equipment and wear the safety equipment. Now, all of the parts in our mold, the patterns are made in a previous video, linked right up here at the top of the screen. And the flask that we use to cast the sand in is in another video, linked up at the top of the screen as well. So if you want to see where the parts came from that we're using in this video, you can go jump up to those before you get started. Otherwise, let's go cast these decoy weights. The first thing that you need to do sand casting is obviously sand, right? Thank you, Captain Obvious, right? But you don't want just any kind of sand. You can't just go and buy play sand at the hardware store and use it directly. This is Founder's Green Sand. And that is a mixture of about 10 to 20% bentonite, 80 to 90% sand. Now, hardware store play sand is a good sand to use. Make sure it's a silica sand and not like a limestone or a shale-based sand, because those won't hold up to the heat that you're going to subject them to. You do need it to be a good silica-based sand, but they are good to use. The bentonite component. Bentonite is a type of clay, and it's pretty widely available in a number of different products. You can buy bentonite labeled as bentonite, as Benseal or Volclay, which are used in the construction industry for sealing around pipes and culverts underground. You can get feed-grade bentonite, which is usually sold as sodium bentonite, as the name on the bag. And that's used in animal feeds. It's used as an emulsifier in certain things. It's used as an antiflocculant in some things. And it's especially used on dairy farms as sort of a substitute for Pepto-Bismol for cows with a bellyache, because it does a really good of absorbing toxins out of the gut the same way activated charcoal does. So it's used that way. So you can get the feed-grade bentonite. And if you're not anywhere near any hardware store or agricultural supply that has either of those two things, you can get bentonite in the form of unscented clumping kitty litter. That's all it is, okay? All of those products are exactly the same chemistry. They will work exactly the same way. The only difference is the words written on the bag and a little bit of granulation size. Sometimes the feed grade stuff is a really fine powder, and that's fine. It'll work perfectly well for this. For this purpose, I don't care how you get your bentonite, but you do need it. And you need, 10 to 20% mixed in with the sand. Okay. This is not rocket science. It doesn't have to be an exact, precise mixture. What you want is, when I take a handful of this, see how I squeeze it and it clumps and it stays in that place. That is the clay sticking the sand together. Now it needs a little bit of water mixed in. And this is where the coarser granules in some forms of bentonite, like the kitty litter forms, they're just going to fall apart as soon as they get wet, right? So I really don't care about that. Okay. Now this I made a while ago and it's dried out a little bit. So it will clump, it will hold its shape, but it takes just a tiny bit of pressure to break it apart. So those molds won't hold together properly. So I need to sprinkle on a little bit more water. And a little dab will do ya. You want the smallest amount of water you can get away with. We don't like water, free water, loose water sitting on the surface. We don't ever want to get hot metal in contact with loose water. Now, this green sand has been used for a very, very, very long time, many thousands of years for sand casting. And it works because the clay holds the water and binds up the water and prevents droplets of loose water from getting in contact with the metal. It's going to steam a little bit, but it's not going to blow and sputter. However, if you get it too wet, it'll blow and sputter, so we don't want that. Okay. So we'll mix that in. You can see how it's getting a little clumpier just from touching it with the hoe. Like I said, when you're making this, it's not a real precise mix. If it doesn't hold together quite well enough, add more clay. If it feels a little gummy and pasty, add a little more sand. It takes a little bit more force. You can see it's not quite as crumbly. You need just a little bit more water. But I mean that literally, just a little bit more. Mix her together. If it ever gets to the point of feeling wet, I mean, you can tell it's a little bit cool to the touch, and that there's moisture in it, but it shouldn't feel wet. That means there's loose water that can sputter with your metal. If it ever gets to the point of feeling wet and still not packing together correctly, add more clay. Ah, there we go. That's good. Nice tight pack. It's just sand and damp clay, so it will always be able to break it apart. But when I feel this and squeeze it, I can squeeze that as hard as I can, and it just feels like a solid rock. Okay? Just that broad pressure won't break it. And when I do make it break, it's still holding together into pieces. That's the right consistency. That's how you want it to behave. So we have our sand ready. I'm going to set up here to make our first mold. So to get started here, the first thing that you have to have is a good flask. This is a wooden flask, this is hardwood.
The video where we made this flask is up at the top of the screen right now if you want to go check it out. Do not chintz out on your flask. There's a lot of folks that are so focused on what they're casting that they cut corners on the materials that they're using to make the casting. And that is a recipe for disaster. Do not make a flask out of pine or softwood. Okay? Use a good hardwood. It's going to flare up a lot less. It's going to cause a lot less trouble. If you make a pine flask, you're going to spend more time putting out fires than casting metal, right? Take the time to do this right, please. It's very, very important. Now, we want to make sure that we've got good lineup, especially on a handmade thing. Sometimes these will fit better one direction or the other. And this is fitting together very, very nicely right here. So I'm going to take this apart. And we're going to start packing the drag. The drag is the bottom part of the mold. Okay. We need a board on the bottom to hold things together, to hold things in. Then we need our patterns. We're going to start with the simplest possible way to make a mold, which is a flat back pattern like this. This is simple because I could just put it on the bottom board. Okay. And I have 4 of these. Just going to put them in here. Centered-ish. Not critical. Okay, I just need to get them in. And once they're in there, well, this is overkill. This is a bigger mold than we need for these itty-bitty patterns. Before we pack sand, we need to dust it with a little bit of talcum powder. This is called parting powder when you're using it. Oh, I don't want to breathe that. Come on, wind. It's called parting powder when we're using it to help the parting of a mold, i.e. helping it come apart. Okay, just a little light dusting in there. You don't need a lot. If you're casting an object that you really care about surface finish, you want to do a couple things differently from what I'm doing right now. First, you have to be very careful about not getting too much parting powder in there, because that can glop a little bit and mar the surface finish in your mold. Okay, so that is an important consideration there. And you would want to use a finer granulation of sand right on the patterns themselves, right? So I am just using all of this coarse sand, because these are lead weights for a duck decoy, and I don't care about surface finish. I just want to get them made. So I'm not being persnickety about that. Want to fill the mold about half up. Get a tampy stick. Lots of technical terms here. We got our tampy stick, and we're going to tamp with the tampy stick. It's nice to do this on a surface. There's an earwig. Go away. That will allow the sand to fall back into its container. You can get commercial casting tables, but a wheelbarrow with a pallet on top works just as well. It doesn't have to be super crazy fancy. Okay. So now we'll get this all the way filled up. A little bit more tampy stick. And the further I get away from the patterns, the less I care about being perfect with the tamping. And then the last step, just take any old scrap, smooth that off. We do want to be a little bit careful that we have it flat-ish, because we have to flip this, which means we need to take another piece of plywood, put that on top, and then flip it without breaking it. And having good contact is going to help that not sag. Okay. So there's the first half of our mold. You can see our patterns embedded in it. Now, another temptation that a lot of people have is to take this and just pour a little well and cut some gates and pour it without making a top mold. Don't do that, because it doesn't let you make a sprue, proper sprue and proper riser system. And you'll get patterns that always shrink way down in, because you don't have a riser full of excess metal to fill as it shrinks. That's all discussed in that introductory video on the theory behind metal casting. Okay? So if what I'm saying doesn't make a whole lot of sense, go check that out. Okay? So we do want to make a nice top mold. So we're going to take our spoon. Just going to carve out a little bit of sand here. Don't need a whole lot. And we're just going to take an item that will be our sprue. We're going to pack that down in. Now it's good to have a little bit of depression in your bottom mold, because there's always going to be a little bit of sand that comes loose in the process of working with this whole contraption. And if this is flat, when the metal comes in, it's going to shoot right into your patterns. And you're going to get a bunch of sand making voids in your pattern. But if you have a little bit of a depression, this goes down in, a lot of that will catch. It'll act as a trap to catch that material. So now we take, where did I put my mold? There's my mold. Take this. We're going to set it up all nice. We're going to lock it down. So the top then is going to go basically the same as the bottom went. We're once again going to start with a little sprinkle of some talcum powder. And this is a completely flat surface, so I'm not as worried about this one. But we still need it there. And then repeat the process. Want to keep that sprue hole relatively straight. The other way that you'll see people do a sprue is to make the mold without one. Just take a piece of copper pipe and just use it like a cookie cutter and cut down through. That certainly works as well. Okay, get that started. Get our fancy dancy tampy stick. Tamp it in nice and good. Okay. Fill her the rest of the way up. Now you definitely need a lot of sand. as evidenced by the fact that I miscalculated how much to put in my wheelbarrow. I had to go get more. This mold is taking about 100 pounds of sand. So if you're buying pre-made foundry sand, you got to make sure you buy enough. If you don't have enough sand, the mold will be weak and will break, and you'll have all kinds of problems again. This is not a big deal if you're making it yourself. But if you're going out and buying something like Petrobond, you got to spend the money to get enough sand. But you don't need fancy stuff. Kitty litter, play sand, and a little water will get you where you need to go. But you need to make sure that you have at least a third more sand than you think you need. And you can see with all the scraping and pounding and falling why it's so handy to have this on a pallet, where's my scraper, over a receptacle. It makes this so much easier. And don't worry, there's plenty of hard work involved. You don't have to feel sad about making a couple steps a little bit easier. Okay, that's all packed in nice. Now, we're going to work on finalizing the mold a little bit. First thing we need to do is cut a little bit of a funnel down around this sprue hole, just to make it easier to hit. Also, one of the nice things about a sand mold is that you can carve it and modify it. Okay. We're going to do a little bit more there before all is said and done, but that's good for now. Now twist your sprue marker, pull that up, leaving that impression, just any sand that's falling loose there. So we did so, just kind of press it down in. Again, this is where you're going to get some little bits that fall down in. Now we want to loosen the attachments. Take this apart. Okay, just going to use these as a handle. Now I'm just going to pick this up and tip it over on its side. Okay, there you can see. Now, you slide. Now you can see the impressions here from the tops of my pattern. Okay, we need to make some air holes. The sand is porous. It will absorb some gases, okay? But we're going to have a large cavity that's going to fill up very quickly with metal, and we want to make sure that those gases get out as quickly as possible. So we're going to come and just take a wire, puncture all the way through the mold, and pull it out like that. And you can do as many of these as you want. You need at least one. They don't have to be super crazy perfect straight. I'm going to do 3 in these larger cavities. This wire is deflecting a lot as it goes through. That is just fine. There we go. Now we have 2 or 3 air holes in the top of each one of these. I'm going to blow away the sand from there. We're going to keep that clean. And now I had a little depression packed in here, and that came up, and we made a replica of that in the top. But I want that top smooth. Can you take that, hon? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to come in with my spoon again and cut that out. Okay. This is going to form our riser. Okay. That's going to be a little reservoir of excess metal, which will allow the gates to feed excess metal into our parts as they cool and shrink. That's how you avoid voids, and you can't do that without having a 2-part mold. That's why I say, even with a flat back pattern, should have a little brush for this, but I don't. Even with a flat back pattern, you don't want to just pour this open face, right? Because you can't make that riser. Now, we need to come and cut some gates so that the metal can get into our patterns. So again, we could just cut this with the spoon. And I don't care about keeping that as deep as it is, so I'm even just going to let that fill up a bit. Okay. You want to make sure that this comes in, makes good contact with your pattern like that. Okay. Again, we'll do it here. Again, we'll do it here. Again, we'll do it here. Okay. Like I said, I want some depth here, but I don't want it as deep as it was, so I'm just going to pack that sand down in that hole. Like I said, we can modify things as we go. Get it packed smooth. And now I'm just going to scoop out a little bit back out, but there is a little bit of depth there. Okay. Put it back in. Kind of that's nice and open. There we go. There's our gate and riser system. And all of this was discussed in earlier videos. And all the patterns I'm making have been made in earlier videos. Now, the last thing that we need to do before we cast this mold is obviously take the patterns out. So we're just going to tap on the ends a little bit to loosen them. And very carefully lift them out. Just like so. Okay. There we go. Do have to be, there a little sand picked up. And this is where that draft comes in. This is why that's so important. You have to have it, or you have no chance of popping those out without losing a whole bunch of your sand. Now, I did lose a little bit right here there. I was able to tap that back in. That's okay. It's a duck decoy weight. It doesn't have to be perfect. Now, I want to cast the drill holes, the screw holes right into here. You have a little piece of stick, and I can just stick this little piece of stick right down into the mold. And then when I pour the lead, carefully go straight down. That will just leave a little hole that I can run my screw directly in. In a fancy full-blown mold, and not just me doing this for fun on a weekend, you can get cores. There you see the sprue, the gate there wasn't quite open, so we want to make sure those are good too. Which are little cylinders of sand that you use to cast cavities like this. But this does not require that level of complexity. We just want to be able to put a screw and a little duck weight. Okay. Blow out all the loose sand. And now that is fully ready to close up and start casting. So here we are, using the proper equipment, you know, the way we should have in the first place, and avoided that little tinsel fairy explosion that you saw back at the beginning of it, right? So this is what the tinsel fairy does. We're going for lead casting, not lead ore, so this is not what we want. Right. Bad news bears. Now, when you're casting lead in a heavy-duty furnace like this, oops. Okay, that's fine. You want to make sure that you don't overheat it, because it can and will start to vaporize at the temperatures that a furnace capable of melting copper and aluminum can produce. Now, what I just put in there was a little bit of wood dust, just some wood shavings from underneath the table saw. Okay, and this is going to produce a little bit of reducing gases that are going to help convert some of the lead oxide that forms at the surface back to lead metal. This is what you use for flux in lead. It is too soft a material to use the mineral fluxes like borax that you use with other metals. And now, all of that is done. I'm just going to keep narrating as I go. We're going to very carefully bring this over and pour it into our mold. Okay, there she's full. Always have a pot handy that you can pour that excess into so it doesn't break your crucible. A little bit came out the end. We'll see if that was a problem or not when we open it. Hopefully it filled completely in spite of that. A lot went down the sprue hole, so I don't think it all came out. Not enough came out there. But this is the value of using a wood that is not all that, sorry, handing out of breath, that's heavy. This is the advantage of using a wood that is not going to flare up real bad. Right where I touched it with the crucible, you can see it did make a mark.
but not real bad. So I'm going to let this cool, and then we will see if that leak was a problem. So now we go hunting for treasure. I picked all of the excess lead here off and put it back in the melting pot. Again, look, you see the cherry. Where I had this sit, it's scarred, but it didn't burst into flame. Here it's scarred, but it didn't burst into flame. There where the lead settled up right on top of it, it's scarred, but it didn't burst into flame. Now we need to see if that leakage ruined the cast. Now what's optimistic is this little piece here is very firmly attached to one of those air vents. Okay, so it did fill. How much did it empty? That's what we don't know. Let's see what we find when we pick the top off. Okay. All of that holding together is also very optimistic. I should be able to pull this out now.
Yeah, air hole.
See, there's the air hole. Okay, so at least that small piece solidified.
Cool.
Chuck it back with the other lead. Okay. Now, this out. That's not what we want. I'm trying to keep all the sand in here so I don't lose it. The first frame out of the way. This is still quite hot, so I have to be careful. Be a smart person, Adam, and poke at it with the tongs, like a smart person would do. Yeah, good. Good, good, good. We had enough excess that it did fill the mold.
It did the thing.
Okay. What we lost was the excess content. Yeah, those are good castings. What we lost was the excess content in the sprue and the risers, which is there to be sacrificial content in the first place. That's hot enough still. I don't want to just up and grab it, as is this. So I'm going to let's give this a minute to cool down. So we can look at what happened here. I just went ahead and I snipped off all of the air hole pieces from the top of this, just with some wire cutters. Right here is where that problem came in. So this little protrusion sticking out there, and I could yes, it's just going to break free if I do a little bend and snap here. Okay. That represents a little spot where there was a piece of sand loose that came out that allowed the metal to escape through there. But let me chuck that in the pot. But if you look at this, it was in the mold in this attitude. So all of the geometry that we wanted to cast was down. So it still filled and it still worked quite nicely. If you see here, this riser system did its job. You see how that's got a depression in it? Okay, that's from the shrinkage. So as all of this shrank, it drew metal out of there and allowed these to have a nice flat top. I just start breaking these pieces off, which, since this is lead, is going to happen pretty easily. Okay. That just goes back in the melt pot for another day. We have these. Now, these little green pieces here, those are my screw holes. And I stuck these in there just as I did in the previous attempt. They just pop right out. And they held that open quite nicely. Okay. So that little quick and dirty core worked very well. I used goldenrod stems for these. Nothing fancy, just a little bit of goldenrod stem for that screw hole. That one broke off, but a screw will just go down through there. Now we want to just take a wire brush and clean all the sand off.
You can see this is a super coarse texture. It's a little coarser than I had hoped, but for a duck weight, I don't really care. But it does go to show you just how much impact the sand that you use has on your finished product, right? So all of those are little spots where the lead penetrated into gaps in between the sand. But you can certainly see the geometry of our mold.
So I'm going to talk about some things that we can do to improve the results. Again, this was an exercise of minimum viable product, but we don't always want the minimum viable product. Sometimes we want a really nice surface finish coming out of the casting. For a decoy, it doesn't matter. And if you're casting something that you're then going to machine further, it also doesn't really matter that much. But if you want to pull this out and be able to go right to finishing and polishing, you know, if you're casting a cleat for a boat or a piece for furniture or something like that, you want a better surface finish. We will in a future video make a finer sand and talk about how to get better surface finish. Also, this was the first time that I used that particular flask, and now that I know that that run out is going to be a problem, you can take the same clay that we used to make this sand mixture, mix it up into a paste, and make a dam around your parts. And that prevents that run out. So now that I know that that's an issue, next time we use that flask, we will do that. So I hope that you will go ahead and subscribe to the channel and come along and see the future videos as they develop, because there's a lot more to come here with our metal casting, with a lot of other things. If you want to help support the channel, this is an unmonetized, unsponsored channel, completely independent. I want to keep it that way. But to do that, we do need a little support for materials to be able to build it and do bigger and better things. So there's a Patreon link at the bottom of the page. The Patreon store has lots of digital resources, and those are free to all patrons at all levels. So I would be very, very grateful if you wanted to wander over there and check that out. But either way, I hope that you will join us here next time at Old Ways Rising Sun.